Thank you once again, Jen and Company. Really good stuff, as always. We want to get into a teaching on Father Abraham. We've been doing different ancestors so far in this new year. We looked at the creation story in Adam and Eve. Last week, we looked at the story of the Great Flood, Noah and company. And today we move away from what scholars looked at as more Jewish mythology into Jewish history. So we're going to talk about Abraham in just a moment. But to get you into the groove and make sure you're all working today, I'm going to make you be just a little bit silly. Do you have it within you to be just a little bit silly today? That didn't sound very convincing at all, really. And I got to tell you, the first service, they killed it. So it's game on, people. Don't screw this up. So I'm going to need you on your feet for this, because there's a little song, maybe if you grew up in church, you remember this, and we're going to need to rock out on this. So Jason, make sure you crank it up just a little bit. This is easy. All you got to do is do what the people on the screens are doing. I'm in it with you, and here we go. Let's do this. All right, clap your hands. Do what they do. Crank it up a little louder, please. Abraham had many sons had Father Abraham. I am one of them, and so are you. So let's all praise the Lord. Right on, Father Abraham had many sons. You're doing pretty good. Father's son had Father Abraham. I am one of them, and so are you. Oh, yeah. So let's all praise the Lord. Right arm, left arm. Father Abraham had many sons. Many sons had Father Abraham. I am one of them, and so are you. So let's all praise the Lord. Right arm, left arm, right foot. Father Abraham had many sons. Many sons have Father. Don't break a hip, okay? I am one of them, and so are you. So let's all praise the Lord. Right arm, left arm, right foot, left foot. Father Abraham had many sons. Many sons had Father Abraham. I am one of them, and so are you. So let's all praise the Lord. Right arm, left arm, right foot, left foot. Nod your head. Father Abraham had many sons. You got this. Many sons had Father Abraham. I am one of them, and so are you. So let's all praise the Lord. Right arm, left arm, right foot, left foot. Nod your head, turn around. Father Abraham, you got it. Many sons, don't fall down. Many sons had Father Abraham. I am one of them, and so are you. So let's all praise the Lord. Right arm, left arm, right foot, left foot. Nod your head, turn around. Jump up and down, clap your hands. Stomp your feet. Amen. 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 Jump up and down. Okay. Clap your hands. Stomp your feet. Amen. Amen. All right. Give yourself a hand. And now I know you're awake. Great job. So we move into this story about Abraham, and how many of you remember that game? It was a board game from the 1960s called Life, the Game of Life. Any of you ever played that game? You get in the little car thing, you spin the deal, and you work your way around the board, and different stuff happens. You land on one space, and it tells you got to owe taxes. You land on another one, you have a kid, and so on and so forth. And the idea is to end with money in the bank, and whoever has the most money is the big winner. It's a fun game. I played it with my brothers and sisters growing up, and it's good stuff. We need to think about Abraham's life like that. That what we see in Genesis 12 to 22 is a story of a life that was
critically important for the people of Israel. When they looked at this, just remember that while we're reading this and we're gleaning from it, it was not really written originally for us in 2020. It was written for the Jewish people. And Genesis as a whole was book one of a 5-part series, and they knew that when they were reading it. So the whole book of Genesis is literally translated as beginnings, is about that. And particularly when you see the character of Abraham, the people of Israel look back at him and say, this is our story. What we see in Abraham, he is the father of our religion. What we see in him in terms of what he did, how we saw God interacting with him, is deeply informative on how we're going to understand ourselves as people of faith. And so we need to think about that as we look in this. And now there are some things, and I've said this for the past few weeks, that scholars recognize that this was probably put down on parchment or whatever they were using while Israel was still in captivity in Babylon. And so they're writing with that perspective in mind. So just a little nerd note, but when you go and read this for yourself, it'll probably not register for you because you're not an ancient Israelite, but there are names of towns and places that did not exist at the time of Abraham. So that tells us that it was written at a much later time. So it also reminds us that this was written for a different people and that they're reading from that perspective. So I just want to walk you through some of the critical stories and just ask some questions about what is the meaning of this and how do we understand this and what do we take home with? What did it mean to the Jewish people? What does it mean to us as people of faith? Individually, as a faith community, as a nation, the whole thing. And so that's where we're going to go. And it all started off like you do in the board game. You start off at the beginning. And this particular thing, we actually it's like we're catching Abraham in the middle of a story because his dad has already moved the family business out of what we would call Iraq or out of Baghdad, north a ways. And now Abraham, who's an adult, gets this invitation. And I actually put it on the back of your little postcardy thing. So check that out. Let's look at it together. Because this is a key verse that's going to show up again later on in Abraham's history. And by the way, this is just a nerd note again. Some of you who are especially nerdy in a biblical way might get on me later because I'm not using the word Abram or Sarai. I'm just going to call them Abraham and Sarah. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, you'll find the answer if you read from Genesis 12 to 22. But anyway, this is how the story starts. Somehow, Abraham senses God speaking to him. And this is what he hears God saying. Leave your country, your family, and your father's home for a land that I will show you. Read that out loud with me. Leave your country, your family, and your father's home for a land that I will show you. I'll make you into a great nation and bless you. I'll make you famous. You'll be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you. Those who curse you, I'll curse. All the families of the earth, all the families of the earth, all the families of the earth will be blessed through you. So right away, we get this picture of God and response to God. Most cultures at that time, they had a quid pro quo way of thinking about God. Are you familiar with the phrase quid pro quo? Is anybody not familiar with that phrase anymore? It means I'll do something for you if you do something for me. That's the gist of it. And most people back in antiquity, that's how they thought about their faith relationship. So if you lived in a very primitive culture and you believed that the gods were instructing the winds and the sun and the rains and all that, you would offer X number of sacrifices to make sure that the rains came in their season. If you were having trouble with infertility and that was your Social Security going forward really, you would offer X sacrifice to get God to make you and your beloved fertile. If you were going to go into a war, you might do X number of sacrifices so that you would win the battle. That's the way they thought about it. They remember that they thought in their worldview the gods really didn't give a rip about people. They kind of looked at us as noisy creatures that they kind of wouldn't mind if we just went away, but we kind of have to play with them anyway because they're there. There was nothing in them in antiquity that said these gods actually care about us beyond using us. But look at what's happening here with this story and this invitation. There's no quid pro quo. It's just, I want to do something special through you, Abraham. No strings attached. You have to join me in what's happening here. But that's not quite quid pro quo. In fact, the language doesn't even work. The framework doesn't work. The paradigm doesn't work. And it's difficult for us to get beyond that because in our world and in our culture, we work that way all the time in relationships, business transactions. It's how we think. But think of it more like this. Picture God conducting a symphony of extraordinarily beautiful, complex music that somehow ties together all the instruments reflected in every single human being. And God is trying to conduct this symphony to play incredibly beautiful music. And some people over history have heard the song and have been captivated by it and want to be a part of it. And they hear the invitation of God to join in the beautiful music. Think about it like that. So you have God saying to Abraham, I want to do something beautiful. I want to do something amazing. I'm trying to play this song, and I'm wanting your voice in the mix. If we have that kind of a paradigm, that kind of a framework, it gets beyond this for that. And basically what it says is to us is, if we want to be a part of the symphony, we got to join in. We have to play our instrument. The symphony is not going to have our voice. The world is not going to hear our part of the song unless we pick up our flute or our sax or our bass or guitar or lend our voice. So it's not a this for that. It's more like you're invited to join in a profound way. And for that profound thing to happen, Abraham had to do something which had to have felt like a leap of faith. Leave your country, your family, and your father's home for a land I will show you. What God's saying here is, we're going to do something very different. And you're not going to be able to do something very different if you are confined by all of these things which have shaped you till now. That raises an important question for us, doesn't it? Jesus had the same thing. He said, come and follow me. And the disciples read that and heard that carefully, and they understood what he meant. And so for the fishermen, that meant that if they were following Jesus, it meant they would leave their fishing nets behind. Zacchaeus would leave his tax collecting stand behind, and others like that. My question for you is, do you first hear this invitation from God because it's for you and me and all humanity? It's the same invitation. And then if your answer is yes, there are probably parts of your life that are already joining in this masterpiece. The question is, what parts aren't? What parts of your life have you stayed in your land, in your country, in your family, because that's what's comfortable? That's the only thing you know. But do you hear the invitation of God coming and saying, if you want this thing, come and follow me? And Abraham was faithful. This is a recurring theme you're going to see throughout his life as he becomes kind of a model person for what living in faith looks like as a real deal human being. And it all starts with, do you hear the invitation? And will you trust God walking forward into that invitation? And that's a question for you and me too. Well, some interesting things happen in his life, to say the least. We go to this thing I'm calling the Sister Act because things kind of went south. Abraham hears this call from God. He goes to the new land where he's supposed to be. Things are going great for a while until they didn't go great. In fact, things went terribly bad. So bad that they had to leave that land that God showed them because there was famine. and they couldn't support themselves. And so he got his whole household together, servants and so forth. I think by this time he was doing pretty good. And they headed to Egypt, where there was food for them along the fertile Nile River. Now think about this. If you are an Israelite in captivity in Babylon, and you're remembering this story that Abraham was called to this, what they would call the promised land, and then it didn't go so well, and they had to go to Egypt. That is going to ring so many bells in your head. It's going to remind you of the whole Exodus event, which is so key to the Israelites' history. And it's going to sing to your soul as a person in Babylon, because you thought God was with you, but now you're under someone else's thumb. And so when we see Abraham go down to Egypt, we learn a couple things. First, we learn about the humanity of Abraham. It's kind of a cute story. So they are, Abraham is 75 years old in this story. Sarah is 65 years old. So, they're what we would call retirement age in that level. Abraham is so convinced that Sarah is so stinking hot that he says to her on the way down to Egypt, I know what's going to happen, babe. This is what's going to happen. We're going to get down there, and the Pharaoh's going to take one look at you, and he's going to want you for his own, and if he thinks I'm your husband, I'm going to get killed so he can make room for himself. And so we don't want that to happen. I love you too much, and I don't want that to happen. So when we get down there, I'll be your brother, and you be my sister, and that way he'll have to pay me respect. And so they did it. And of course, just as Abraham had predicted, she was so beautiful that she was gathered up for the Pharaoh and started to go through the process of getting her ready, I imagine, to be one of his many wives. And then things started to go bad for Pharaoh. Meanwhile, Abraham is getting crazy rich because Pharaoh wants to impress the brother. So he's increasing his portfolio significantly, but then some tragedy starts to fall on Pharaoh's house and government. And they get the tip off that this is not a sister, but a wife. And instead of killing Abraham, they just sent him away as fast as they could. Now, what that told Abraham, and by extension the people of God, is that even though you are not in your homeland, God is still with you. You can go as far as you want, all corners of the earth. God is still really with you. This is an important question for us, because there are sometimes we make decisions in our lives and we feel like God is 100% behind us, and we are absolutely certain this is the thing that we are supposed to do, and it feels right, and we get off to a good start. It might be starting a business, a relationship, whatever it might be, and then the wheels come off the bus. We lose the job. We have to close the business. Our beloved dies, or gets sick, or divorced, or whatever. And our lizard brain takes over and starts wondering, because life stinks right now, does it mean that God has abandoned me? And the answer we get clearly from Abraham, and he does this act twice, by the way, is no. God is with you, even and especially when it's hard. And so, I just want to ask you, is that where you are right now? Because my hunch is that some of you are, and you're just wondering if God forgot about you or doesn't care. And I just hope you'll breathe in the reality that God is still with you, still loves you, still cares, just like God was with Abraham back then. Sometimes it's not going to go great, but that doesn't mean that God's not with us. Well, sometimes we screw things up. Well, speaking for myself, sometimes I screw things up. You may be doing it beautifully. Abraham messed some things up, and now they're older. They're like 90 and 100 years old. And they're remembering this promise of God, I'm going to make you into a great nation, which requires a lot of people. And they're looking around and they don't have any kids. And they're getting up there. And so they take matters into their own hands. And this was a vehicle, a mechanism that was available to them, which made sense back then. And the idea was Sarah would hand over her maidservant, Hagar, to Abraham to become his wife. Maybe they would have children together, and they would claim that child as their own, and then that's how God was going to make things happen. They never heard that from God, but that made sense in their culture. We're just going to figure out what we're doing because God apparently, is wanting us to do something, and the old-fashioned way isn't working, so let's try this. And so it happens. Hagar's given to Abram as a wife. Remember, women are property at this time in history. And lo and behold, she becomes pregnant by this 100-year-old groom. Even though it was Sarah's idea, she immediately gets jealous. She not only gets jealous, but she doesn't manage it well. And her jealousy turns into rage and anger. And that anger was so hostile that Hagar had to leave. She would rather walk into a hot desert all by herself with no provisions than live in that kind of a tyranny. Sometimes we do things that cause great pain in other people. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but you're going to find out that they have this kid named Isaac, Sarah and Abraham. I'll get into that in a little bit, but as soon as Isaac is born, Sarah turns again on Hagar and says to Abraham, I want them out. I don't want them in my sight. Get rid of them. And Pete Enns, the author of the book Genesis for Normal People, he says that, so Abraham went along with it. In other words, he agreed with it to appease his wife, maybe because he could see the problem, although by this time his son was now 13 years old, and he had a good relationship with this Ishmael. So when he sent them out, you would think a loving father would make sure they had plenty of provisions to make it on their own. But as Pete Enns says, Abraham sent them out with a Dixie cup of water into the desert. We have a mixture of things happening here. First, we have the story where the Israelite people are looking at that and saying, "Whew, that was a mistake." Is God going to turn God's back on Abraham and Sarah because they made such a terrible, cruel mistake? And the answer was no. But there was also something else, that when we do things in our own way, and when we give into that kind of a rage and jealousy and don't manage those things and pursue health in those ways, we are entirely capable of doing horrible things to each other, to other human beings. And so it causes us to take stock and just wonder, what are we really capable of? And have we ever committed such a foul? On the flip side, you have this kid Ishmael, who is currently, before Isaac's born, the only son of Abraham, and they love each other. And the beautiful thing is that when Hagar goes out again, first time she fled the violence in the home, and now she's being kicked out. Both occasions, God meets her there. And that is such a beautiful statement about God, that even though God was going to build this thing through Isaac, God recognizes that Hagar and Ishmael also matter. So God meets her in her weeping and wailing and says, "Take comfort, I will bless you too. I am with you too." And gives her and him a great promise. Ishmael, by the way, many years down the road, became the nation, or is the ancestor of the nation of Islam. And so when we see that, we see there's enmity in the household, in the camps, and yet we're reminded of how God feels about them and the blessing that God has for those who've been trounced on. So some of you are the ones who did the trouncing, the Sarahs, and the good news for you and me is that it doesn't end God's grace for us. God still loves us. There are consequences. They're going to be long-lasting. But we're not alone. And some of you have been the Hagar and the Ishmael. And you've been given a bad hand that was out of your control. And the good news for you is God sees your pain, and God is with you. Well, then things get kind of weird. God speaks to Abraham again, and he hears him. He says, hey, I want to set a sign for the people of Israel so that everybody will know that you're my people. And he kind of chronicles a little bit, says, well, when Noah and the whole flood thing happened, I gave a sign then, that I would be with you. I'm never going to destroy the earth. And the sign that I gave Noah was this beautiful rainbow across the horizon. But for you, Abraham, I have a different idea. How does circumcision grab you? Can you imagine what Abraham's thinking? But Noah got a rainbow. So all the men in Abram's camp, starting with Abraham and Ishmael, Isaac's not born yet, and all 300 and some male servants of Abraham headed over to Great Clips. What do you have? I'll just take a little off the top, please. I've been working on that joke all week. Well, anyway, so they have this, they all get circumcised, which is this horrible, horrible reality. And they're not the only culture that's ever done this. Other parts of the world use this as a rite of passage kind of a thing. It's weird and gross. I completely agree. But there it is. And so people wonder, scholars have wondered and debated why. Why in the world this? And really, there's a couple schools of thought. One is kind of from a scientific thing, like maybe it's a hygiene thing. Like maybe if this happens, especially back in antiquity, maybe it's going to prevent some diseases or something like that. Maybe, I don't know. But actually, more scholars just simply look at it as this. It is a physical representation of what Abraham was called to do in the first place. It is a cutting off that costs you something, that is memorable, that you're going to see and say, this is a sign of that. You are cut off from the paradigms of the rest of the world. We're doing a new thing here. And, if we really think about this, those things that really matter to us, we've invested in. Now the Israelite men literally have skin in the game. This is, I know, pretty good though. Come on. I'm here all week. But the thing is, they were invested. And they're like, do I really believe this thing? Or are we going to get out of here like tonight before Great Clips opens, right? And they decided to believe with Abraham. And just think about how that galvanized things. We are in this. We are really, really in this. And so it just raises a question, because some of us have just simply grown up in the Christian tradition, and we take so much for granted because it's just been handed to us. Do you realize that there is a massive difference between just sort of adopting it, embracing it in some kind of casual way, and actually investing yourself in it? And I'm wondering if there's something that God might be asking of you that feels costly. It could be getting you out of your comfort zone in terms of how you view yourself. Maybe you have a personal narrative where you've told yourself, because other people, circumstances or whatever, have created within you a self-dialogue that really keeps your self-esteem very low. And you feel not so great about yourself. But it's very comfortable. Even though it's abusive to you, it's comfortable and known, but not well. And maybe the thing you're being invited to cut off is that way of looking at yourself. Instead, looking at yourself through the lens of God. That you are dearly and deeply loved as God's child. Maybe for you, it's how you're dealing with the people around you, and it's an interpersonal thing. And you're carrying around rage and anger, and you see things and you hate it and you speak it, and it's affecting your attitude. And maybe that is a thing that needs to be cut off because it's not reconciliatory. And the grace of God leads us towards restoration. And so for you, the circumcision is to let go of the anger and the hate. And in our climate and our culture that is so binary, so black and white, sometimes very literally. It comes along black and white lines, but because there is such hostility in the air, we can easily find ourselves sliding right into it. And it's comfortable, it's culturally accepted, and still destructive. Maybe that's what you're being called to cut off. Maybe, I don't know what it is. What is it that you're being called into by the presence and Spirit of God? It's going to cost you something. Of course it is, but it's worth it. Well, then we get into what I'm calling barter. I'm just having some fun play on words because it's we know it as Bay Area Rapid Transit System, but there was an actual barter that happened. So Abraham's sitting on the edge of his tent, and he sees these three guys coming at him, and something about these three visitors told him there's something special. And so he did a crazy thing. Normally you would do this kind of a thing for like a wedding or a big festival. He killed a fattened calf for these three people. So something about him was like, wow, okay, I'm going to roll it out for these guys. I want to be on their side and ingratiate myself to them because I can tell something's up. These turned out to be messengers of God in some respect. It's a little bit mysterious. There are three of them. That kind of makes us think about Trinitarian theology and so forth. But these three guys are there, and he has a meal with them, and things continue. They have this conversation, and he finds out why they're there. And the reason why they're there is that they're coming as messengers of God because the cries from violence from the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah have come all the way up to heaven. And they want to go see for themselves. And if it's true, they want to wipe out, they want to completely incinerate both towns. Must be pretty bad. And so they're on their way, and Abraham hears this, and it's a fascinating exchange. So Abraham, just before they go, he says, wait a second. So let me get this straight. You're going to go there, if it's as bad as they say, you're just going to wipe it out. What if so you got 500 people in this little village. What if 50 of them are really wonderful people? Maybe babies, children, nice people. Are you still going to wipe out the whole thing because of 50? And the messenger says back, no, you're right. For the sake of 50, we won't do it. And then he goes again, he barters a little bit more. What about 40? So you said okay to 50. What about 40? I mean, for the sake of 10 people, are you still going to wipe out everything? And the messenger says, you're right. For 40. And he keeps working him down until he gets down to 10. So it's for the sake of 10 people. If you find 10 good people in Sodom and Gomorrah, will you hold off? And the answer was, okay, for the sake of 10 people, we'll hold off. What is happening here? Well, it's not so much what we learn about God. It's what we're learning about Abraham, the father of the faith. Because what this dialogue represents is that Abraham wants to honor true justice. And he recognizes that it's not just for these innocent people to die because the overwhelming majority of people are awful. And so it's a nod for future generations to be asking that question. What does it mean for us to be a people of God, a God who is just and good, who holds this mercy and justice thing in careful balance? What does it mean for us thinking forward as we create policy? And I got to tell you, we struggle with this as human beings. Somebody hurts me, I'm going to hurt them worse. That's the way it works. In our country, you punch the United States, you are going to get pummeled by the United States. That's how we've been. And yet the voice of Abraham is, this thing needs to be fair and right and just. And God was on board with it. So we learn something about what it means to be the people of God, and we learn something about the just nature of God. Well, we're getting close to the end here. The next thing has to do with laugh. Oh, by the way, he does go to Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah has absolutely nothing to do with homosexuality, by the way. You can take that to the bank. It has to do with rape and violence. It's been used, co-opted as a vision of that, but it has nothing to do with that. Come to Praxis, and we'll unpack that a little bit this Wednesday, but just know that. So let's get on to Isaac. One of the things that happened in this exchange with these three messengers is they made a prediction, and they said, about a year from now, you guys are going to have a bouncing baby boy. And Abraham is looking at these guys. He says, I'm 100 years old. That's not going to happen. He laughs out loud when he hears the news. And the guys say, we're serious. And so he calls out for Sarah and says, hey, Sarah, get a load of this. These guys say that a year from now, we're going to create a baby. And guess what she does? She laughs out loud. Darlene Tremewen sitting right here. You are not yet 90 years old. Can you imagine having a bouncing baby boy by this time next year? Right, look what you just did. You laughed out loud because it sounds so preposterous. Isaac's name translates as laughter. That's what Isaac means in Hebrew, is laughter. Because every time they would hear the name, they're not laughing at him, but they're like, this is a crazy story. And it is a crazy story. I wonder if one of the lessons here is for us, not just God's faithfulness to bring things about, but that it would happen in a kind of a crazy way. And I wonder what crazy thing God might be inviting you to, recognizing that we play a role in the crazy thing that God wants to do in the world. That might seem counterintuitive. It just doesn't make any sense, but God is sort of behind it, and so we just take a leap of faith. Because let's be honest, you've got a 100-year-old man. You've got a 90-year-old woman. They've been together a very long time. It could be that that expression of their relationship had sunsetted some time ago. You can just imagine Abraham and Sarah, after these guys leave, thinking to themselves, that's crazy. That's crazy. No way. And you know what they could have done? They could have chosen not to sleep together. They could have chosen not to even try. But they did. They decided to get on board with something crazy. And I'm wondering if there's a crazy thing that God is inviting you to do. Don't take this too literally, by the way, Darlene. Or we're going to have some words, all right? But we're talking metaphorically now, okay? But I'm wondering how we might be asking this for ourselves, because there could be a whisper, a nudge, something in our hearts that says, I think God wants me to try this crazy thing, and it might be actually true, but to actually see it come about means that you have to have faith enough to actually do your part to make it happen. God is conducting a symphony. He wants your part, but you're not going to get to play in the symphony unless you pick up what you've got, your instrument, your voice, whatever that might be. Well, we end the story. Abraham dies. Hopefully that's not a spoiler for anyone, but he dies. And he dies pretty well after Sarah. He got along great with the surrounding communities, which also needs to be informative to us. So this guy who's starting this new thing, the people around him love him. They highly regard him. We need to learn that in the United States as Christian people, because the Christian people as a whole in the United States are not regarded with great height. But we are seen collectively, painted with one brush nationwide. We're painted as judgmental, bigoted, fill in the blank. Anti this, anti that, in the way. We need to learn from Abraham how to be a good neighbor because he was loved and revered. Even when there were delicate operations and decisions that had to be made, he was still known as somebody that was a good neighbor. He was so loved that this wandering Abraham, with all of his flocks and stuff, was allowed to purchase property. So he bought a cave and some land around it, and that's where he buried his beloved Sarah. And when it came time for him to die, he was buried right next to her. The beautiful thing about this is that he did rest in peace. It's remarkable. 2 of his sons buried him. He, by the way, after Sarah, he got remarried a few times, had lots of other kids. 2 of his sons buried him in the cave of Mamre. Isaac, you would guess, and Ishmael. Ishmael, the one that was kicked out, the one that was treated so harshly, came back. You know, to me, I hear that And I just wonder, what is it about Abraham that because of his relationship with God, his faith, he couldn't let this relationship with his son, who he loved, go down bad? What did he do to reconcile that pain and that agony, that wound, so that when Abraham finally died, his eldest son came back to pay respects alongside the brother that got him kicked out? Oh, man. We're going to see that theme come up again next week, too. But how does that then instruct us as people of God about how we deal with internal bad relationships, and what are we about as people in terms of reconciling things? Wouldn't it be beautiful if the people of God, we Jesus followers, could be known as the reconcilers, the ones who really do bring peace wherever they go, in our families, in our communities, in our nation, in our world? Wouldn't that be marvelous? It's almost related to this idea of shalom, a Jewish word, which means a holistic kind of peace or well-being, which happens to be the name of the song that God has been trying to play from the very beginning, that you and I are invited to play in and a part of, to allow that theme song to be the song of our lives. No matter where the transcript takes us, we are carried by the music of shalom, of peace, of wellness, of wholeness, well-being, the whole thing for ourselves, our families, our friends, for the world. So we have a lot to learn from Abraham, don't we? About what it means to be faithful to a God who is faithful, who calls us to leave what we know to do something different. And I'm not sure exactly what that looks like for you, but I'm sure the call is there. And I'm sure the invitation to this song is there. And I'm just hoping that your spirit recognizes it and says yes. Let's pray together. What a beautiful song is Shalom. What an extraordinary, generous invitation you have extended to us. With everything in you saying, I'm with you, I love you, follow, be a part, leave behind, go to the new. Trust me. These are the whispers in our ear today. May we hear them. May we know they're from you. May we be present. May we be open. And may we be faithful. Amen. Thanks for coming today. I hope you had a great experience. If you've got any comments for us, please fill those out on your little cards and stick them on the table, as well as any offering you might have to support what we're trying to do. Crosswalk's an awesome place. Thanks for being a part of us. We will see you next week. Go Niners and Chiefs. All right.